Hey everybody, it's Josh KI6NAZ. We're starting off the series on sub-element 1, the first sub-element for getting your technician license. Remember, all links for all the information on how to study and what I recommend are in the description. I want to again encourage and thank you for pursuing this license, and I really hope you enjoy amateur radio. Sub-element 1, the purpose of this is the permissible use of amateur radio service, operator primary station license grant, the meanings and basic terms used in the FCC rules, FCC guidelines on interference, RACES rules, which is an emergency preparedness group or emergency response group for communication, phonetics, and what the frequency coordinator is. There is a lot in this subsection. It's broken up into 6 individual sections within the sub-element. There are a lot of questions, and they mainly have to do with rules. So this is one of those subsections, I'll just mention this right up front, where you generally want to side to the, you personally are going to be responsible for what you do with radio. Amateur radio is different from GMRS or CB radio, where the license is tied to more or less the radio, and the radio's kind of ratcheted down and tightened up to the point that it's just a channelized service. With amateur radio, we pretty much can do what we want regarding hardware we use, antennas we use, power up to a certain limit. And that kind of means that we have to be responsible and take a lot of that responsibility on ourselves. So, question 1, this is sub-element 1, Alpha 01. It's broken up into Alpha, Beta, Charlie, Delta, Echo, and Foxtrot. Those are the letter characters that break up this sub-element. Which of the following is part of the basis and purpose of amateur radio service? I'm only going to mention the right answers here. I find that if you focus on the right answers and what the meaning is behind them, you will do a lot better in not having to learn all of this stuff that more often than not is just incorrect. So why would you go spend a lot of time learning what is incorrect about something? Even if it is a true answer to a different question, you don't want to get the two wrapped up around the axle in your brain and forget what the right answer is. So the answer to this is C, advancing skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio art. And again, that's a kind of high-minded question. I'll repeat it. Which of the following is part of the basis and purpose of the amateur radio service? What's the purpose? Advancing the skills in technical and communication phases of the radio art. In other words, experimenting, building radios, building software that works with our radios, building antennas. That's the technical aspect that we're trying to foster with this service. And then the communication aspect is then obviously once you have built this stuff or bought a radio from a store, how do you use it? That's the point of this. It's an actual self-perpetuating kind of service where we're encouraged to experiment and grow in our mental and physical capability to build and advance technically, but also are encouraged to operate once we have that knowledge. Question Alpha 02, which agency regulates and enforces the rules for their amateur radio service in the United States? The answer is the FCC. This is for the United States technicians. Technician is a license level for the United States. If you're watching this in another country, while the content may be valuable, these questions are going to differ from what your country might require you to take. And yes, it's also called something different. There are FCC-like organizations in other countries. Alpha 03, what do the FCC rules state regarding the use of a phonetic alphabet for the station identifying in the amateur radio service? And it's B, it's encouraged. The phonetic alphabet, which is something you'll learn as you get more involved with amateur radio, helps us make sure our messages are received on the other end. And by messages, I just mean our communication. So if I say KI6NAZ into a radio, that's kind of fast. But if I say Kilo India 6 November Alpha Zulu, that's a lot easier to hear on the other end. And the word actually put together like Zulu, there's not a lot of things you can mess that up with, so you think Z or Z when you hear that. Question Alpha 04, how many operator primary station license grants may be held by any one person? And the answer is 1. You have one license, that's yours, that's all there is to it. Question Alpha 05, what proves that the FCC has issued an operator primary license grant? And the answer for that is C. The license appears in the FCC ULS database. The FCC runs a website. You should go make an account on this website before you go take your test so that you have the appropriate information to give to whomever you're taking your test with. This would also highly be encouraged that you associate your account to a P.O. box before you take your test if you are interested in protecting some of your personal privacy. Normally, you have to provide an address for where you live, but a P.O. box can function in that role as well. And the purpose of the P.O. box is so that the FCC can send you communications that they need to instead of call or email, but they'll also go that route as well. But P.O. box, if you want a P.O. box to protect your anonymity some, this would be the point where you need to do this before you get your license, before you test. Very important. Question Alpha 06, what is the FCC Part 97 definition of a beacon? A beacon is an amateur radio station transmitting communication for the purpose of observing propagation or related experimental activities. There are some frequency spaces within our allocations that are used, most commonly agreed to frequency spaces for beaconing. And what is a beacon? Well, a really good example exists on 10 meters. There are quite a few of them actually, and they are Morse code beacons. And what they'll do is they'll transmit a call sign and then a couple of beeps or some amount of characters and then repeat the process over again. And you're like, well, what's the point of that? Well, I mentioned in the beginning of this whole series how propagation works, the refraction of RF off the atmosphere. Well, if there's a station, let's say it's in South America, and most of the time you can't hear it, right? You're on that beacon frequency, and these are published online. There's actually a website you can go to go to the specific frequency for these beacons. And if you start hearing that South American beacon on that frequency, well, you've just determined that the path between your two stations is viable. And the coolest part about this is this beacon frequency is often used by a networked group of beacons. At least it's kind of all connected via this website. And you can watch on this website which beacons are transmitting at any one moment. And if you hear any one of those beacons and their associated call signs, you know that there's a high likelihood that there's a path open to that international station, what we call a DX station. So beacons are incredibly helpful, particularly on 10 meters, which is great for technicians. Question Alpha 07, what is the FCC Part 97 definition of a space station? This is C. An amateur station located more than 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. There you go. Pretty self-explanatory. Question Alpha 08, which of the following entities recommends transmit, receive channels, and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations? And that's B, the volunteer frequency coordinator recognized by local amateurs. This is one of the first questions that we're going to be talking about where we see a lot of the FCC pushing the policing, the logistics, the organization of amateur radios back onto the amateurs. In this case, the volunteer, keyword, frequency coordinator that is recognized by local amateurs. And more specifically, we might be, or you might not be familiar with what a repeater is. A repeater is kind of like a decently sized, decently powered radio station that we can talk into, and it simultaneously transmits on a slightly different frequency. And so we can have handheld radios that will switch between the transmit and receive frequencies as we're talking. And so that means that with our little Baofeng handhelds or our cheap little radios, we can talk into the repeater, and that repeater simultaneously boosts and transmits our signal out to a much wider footprint than we'd be able to do with our little handheld. Well, if you think of here in Southern California, there's lots of repeaters. and coordinating the frequency pairs, and yeah, they're two discrete frequencies, transmit and receive, that those repeaters work on. That's done via the coordination of the volunteer frequency coordinators. If we didn't have that, we'd have repeaters that would be on the same frequencies that were in that same general footprint, causing chaos with each other. So yeah, there's some repeaters that have the same frequency pairs, but they're separated by great distances, which means they don't interfere with each other, which is a good thing. Question Alpha 09. Who selects a frequency coordinator? C. Amateur operators in a local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be repeater or auxiliary stations. Again, FCC pushing the responsibilities onto us amateurs to manage ourselves. Alpha 10. What is the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service, the acronym RACES? And D, all of these choices are correct. So the RACES is a radio service using amateur frequencies for emergency management or civil defense communication. Yep, that makes sense. It's an emergency service. A radio service using amateur stations for emergency management or civil defense communications. Almost a retelling of the same thing from A. And then C, an emergency service using amateur operators certified by a civil defense organization as being enrolled in that organization. A lot of word salad on those three, kind of saying the same thing, so all these choices are correct. Alpha 11, the last of category alpha within sub-element 1. When is willful interference to other amateur radio stations permitted? And the answer is B, at no time. This deserves its own video series, probably not as big as this one's going to be, on interference, people fighting on the air, bad manners on the air. Amateur radio operators are human beings at the end of the day. We're not any different than any other hobby or service that you've worked with, or profession for that matter. There are bad actors abound, and there's sometimes people who are normally good people just having a bad day, and this can happen on the air as well. The answer for most of issues that you run into on the air is spin the dial, get away from the bad actor, and don't engage. Engaging just makes things even more problematic and has, in some cases, historically, led to much larger issues than just two people having a tiff on the air. If you think people fight on the internet, which of course we do, well, ham radio and people fighting there is kind of like the original social media, and so it's existed for as long as there's been a way for any two humans to communicate. There's been fighting. So don't interfere, just get out of the way. Now that's the hostility side, the human aspect. But your radio can sometimes interfere without your knowledge. When you're made aware that there could be an issue with your station, that it is interfering with others, please just discontinue the transmission, discontinue the service, or take it offline until the point that you can figure out what the issue is, and then return it to service. All right, sub-element 1, now we're in the section B, section Bravo. So this is Bravo number 1. Which of the following frequency ranges are available for phone operation by technician licenses? This specifically is talking about 10 meters, our 10-meter band. And that frequency range is 28.300 megahertz to 28.500 megahertz. So anywhere within that space, you as a technician can do voice operation. And just so we're clear, that's a pretty wide bandwidth space for technicians to play in. You will be able to do things like Parks on the Air, talk to DX stations, a myriad of other things, all on 10 meters, particularly as we reach that high intensity of solar cycle 21, which will be peaking in 2025. Question Bravo number 2. Which amateurs may contact the International Space Station on VHF bands? And the answer is B, any amateur holding a technician class or higher license. Great. One of the big perks with amateur radio is we have a myriad of amateur radio satellites. One of those satellites is manned by human beings, the International Space Station, and sometimes they get on the radios, they have multiple radios, and then other times we can just use it as a repeater, a cross-band repeater, much like we have on the mountaintops, but just a lot higher. There's also slow scan television transmissions from the ISS, among a couple other things like APRS, Automatic Packet Reporting System, that we can all play with when it's flying overhead. Very cool. Question Bravo 03. What frequency is in the 6 meter band? 6 meters is also a band where amateur radio technicians have full access to. And the answer to this one is really easy to remember, at least I think it is. It's the only one that has 50 in it, in megahertz. So the answer is B, 52.525. Generally, you'll hear me say that a lot. Generally, a band has a number associated to it. 10 meters is 28 megahertz. 20 meters is 14 megahertz. 40 meters is 7 megahertz. In the case of 6 meters, it's a decently wide band. So if you just remember it's in the 50s, you're good for this question. Question Bravo 04. Which amateur band includes 146.520? And when we say band, we're talking about frequency spaces. 146.520, by the way, program this into your radios, is the national calling frequency for the 2 meter band. It is one of the most used frequencies for an emergency call that someone may make on their handheld radio. 2 meters is generally the band that people operate on when it comes to simplex, and simplex is point to point, not using a repeater. So you should have that in your radio, and that answer is 2 meters. Question Bravo 05. How may amateurs use the 219 to 220 megahertz segment of the 1.25 meter band? And the answer is D, fixed digital message forwarding systems only. Okay, let's talk about that in a little more detail. This is a reference or a shout out to hamstudy.org as you are reading the test questions. If you're in the studies section, you can always click on the little info page, which is a little dog-eared looking page on the website. And this says, whenever there is a part of the band that is reserved for data, that's what we're talking about here, data transmission, it is generally the lowest part, and so it makes sense that the range at the bottom of the 220 megahertz range would be for data. In point of fact, all non-data frequencies allowed to amateur radio operators in the 1.25 meter band are from 222 megahertz to 225 megahertz, and that block allows phone and image transmission. 219 to 220 is for fixed digital message forwarding systems only. So keep that in mind for digital transfers. Yes, digital modes, digital data, sending emails over our radio. Ooh, it's like we're in the 90s again. I'm just kidding. Question Bravo 06. On which HF bands does a technician class operator have phone privileges? And the answer is B, 10 meter band only. Only. So 6 meters isn't considered HF in this particular question. And phone specifically is voice communication. Technicians also have some access on other, what we call lower frequency HF bands, but it's Morse code only, which still really usable, still really fun, but that's the limitation. Think about getting your general after you watch this video. Question Bravo 07. Which of the following VHF, UHF band segments are limited to CW only? And here's a forwarding. Question Bravo 07. Which of the following VHF, UHF band segments are limited to CW only? So we're talking about 2 meters and 70 centimeters, handheld radio type spaces. And the answer is A, 50 megahertz to 50.1 megahertz, and 144 megahertz to 144.1 megahertz. Question Bravo 08. How are U.S. amateurs restricted in segments of bands where the amateur radio service is secondary? Secondary means we're not the primary operator. There are other people that are there, and they generally have a priority over us. And that's A, U.S. amateurs may find non-amateur station in those segments and must avoid interfering with them. Interfering is just like, hey man, how's it going? What are you up to? Sometimes this could be the military, so keep that in mind. We don't want to interfere with what they're doing. Question Bravo 09. Why should you not set your transmit frequency to be exactly at the edge of the amateur band or sub-band? This is one of those all choices are correct. Another one, D. All these choices are correct, and let me read them out. A. To allow for calibration error in the transmitter frequency display. Some radios, particularly older radios, have what we call drift. And that's where we may have the readout of the radio centered exactly on a frequency we think we have, but the radio's like, I'm a little bit out of tune, much like a car can get out of tune, and it's transmitting a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right of what you think it is. That's a calibration problem that you can generally fix, but you got to stay cognizant of it, particularly as you're lining up on the very left or very right most side of that frequency space. B, so that modulation sidebands do not extend beyond the band edge. Again, center frequency is not like, you're not just transmitting on that little single frequency digit that you're looking at on the display. Your frequency bandwidth is much wider than that, and you need to compensate for that bandwidth by staying off that band edge to the appropriate amount of bandwidth to avoid that. And C, to allow for transmitter frequency drift. Well, okay, I kind of already answered that for you. But there you go. Question Bravo 10. Where may single sideband, abbreviated as SSB, phone be used in amateur bands above 50 megahertz? And the answer is C, in at least some segment of all of these bands. Let's break that one down a little bit. Earlier, we talked about how digital modes and Morse code are generally on the lower side of whatever band you're on. Well, if your band of operation includes a segment that is considered for voice or for phone, then you can do single sideband in that band space. It's generally on the higher side of the bands. So that's the answer to that question. Question Bravo 11, what is the maximum peak envelope power, or PEP, as we abbreviate, output for technician class operators in the HF band segments? Straight up answer, just remember it, A, 200 watts. Question Bravo 12, except for some specific restrictions, what is the maximum peak envelope power, PEP or PEP, output for technician class operators using frequencies above 30 megahertz? And the answer for that is 1500 watts. It is D. All right, so that was segment or section Bravo in subelement 1. We're going into Charlie. So this is Charlie number 1. For which license classes are new licenses currently available from the FCC? The answer is D, technician, general, and amateur extra. Those are the 3 classes that are available at this time. If you would like to go into the history of amateur radio, there used to be different classes like novice, technician plus, I think there's another one, and advanced. Those have been sunset for the technician, general, and extra that we have today. Question Charlie 02. Who may select a desired call sign under the vanity call sign rules? The answer is any licensed amateur, but as you progress into general and extra, you get access to ever-shortening call signs. So your abbreviators become what we call a 1x2 in the case of an extra, meaning you have a letter, a number, and then 2 letters, or a 2x1. 2 letters, 1 number, and then 1 letter after that, 2x1. And those vary. But technicians, if you want a vanity call sign, you can do that. No big deal. Just not going to be the small ones. Charlie 03. What type of international communications are an FC licensed amateur radio station permitted to make? This is A, communications incidental to the purpose of amateur radio service and remarks of personal character. It'll come up later, but you can't conduct a business with amateur radio. And so this is adding international communication, but if you generally stick to the guideline that you can't be doing business on amateur radio, and you can't be broadcasting like a broadcast commercial radio station would, and it is a conversation that you're having with someone even outside the country, it's generally okay as long as you stick to those guidelines. Question Charlie 04. What may happen if the FCC is unable to reach you by email? This is a newer question. B, revocation of the station license or suspension of the operator license. Yeah, it used to be just address, like a physical address it used to have. Now you also need to have an email address, which, to be honest, I'd prefer them just emailing me anyway and not even have the physical address thing anymore. But hey, I'm not in charge. Charlie05, which of the following is a valid technician class call sign format? And that's A, and it's Kilo Foxtrot 1 X-ray, 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 or just KF1XXX. And that's where you see what I mentioned earlier, the 2x1 or the 1x2 call sign that is reserved for amateur extras only. Charlie06, from which of the following locations may an FCC licensed amateur station transmit? And the answer is D, from any vessel or craft located in international waters and documented or registered in the United States. And this one's got a fairly specific boating question. Now, I will add one caveat to this. While by the books and on paper, this is the answer. As always, if you're not the captain of that vessel, you need to check with that captain. And specifically, I'm thinking cruise ships are where you need to ask that question. Charlie07, which of the following can result in revocation of the station license or suspension of the operator license? And that's B, failure to provide and maintain a correct email address with the FCC. So really driving that one home. Get an email address and make sure it stays valid. Always, if you do change your email address, you can log into the ULS database, which the FCC runs on their website, and you can update your account's email address that's connected to your call sign. Charlie08, what is the normal term for an FCC-issued amateur radio license? 10 years. In 10 years, you have to re-extend your license, if you will, every 10 years. Charlie09, what is the grace period for renewal if an amateur radio license expires? And that's A, 2 years. So there is a bit of an extension to make sure that you get it renewed if you go past that 10-year mark. If it does expire completely, then you will have to retest for whatever license you held. Charlie 10. How soon after passing the examination for your amateur radio station radio license may you transmit on the amateur radio bands? This is specific for you technician license holders. As soon, Charlie, C is the answer, as soon as your operator station license grant appears in the FCC license database. If you don't have a call sign, you can't transmit, and you have to wait for your call sign to be uploaded onto the database for it to be considered valid, and then at that point you can begin transmitting. This is not really a topic for this video, but if you get your general license and you have a call sign and you pass your general test, then you can immediately start using those privileges. You just need to append your call sign with slant AG for amateur general. Charlie 11. If your license has expired and is still within the allowable grace period, 2 years, may you continue to transmit on the amateur radio bands? D, no. You must wait until the license has been renewed. So if you've expired your license, meaning you've gone outside the 10-year period, but are still within the 2-year grace period, you can't transmit. Your license isn't gone, but you need to renew it before you can then continue to transmit. And that was the last of the Charlie section of Subelement 1. So the Delta section, let's start that off with Delta 01. With which countries are FCC licensed amateur radio stations prohibited from exchanging communication? And that is A, any country whose administration has notified the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, that it objects to such communications. So that's like on their end. That country says, we don't want our people talking on this radio thing. Don't talk to them. And so we're prohibited from talking to them. Delta 02, under which of the following circumstances are one-way transmissions by an amateur station prohibited? This is always going to be broadcasting. Again, a good example, turn on your FM radio in your car and listen to a station. They don't let another station transmit on the same frequency that they're on. They hold that frequency and they transmit on that frequency, and they're doing business generally. We can't do that. We can't play music. We can't do business on radio, so we're not allowed to broadcast, and that's what that term means in this case. Delta 03, when is it permissible to transmit messages encoded to obscure their meaning? All you preppers out there, You're probably been asking this question or thinking, and it's C, only when transmitting control commands to space stations or radio-controlled craft. That's the only time you can do encoded messages that obscure their meaning. And so some of you will naturally bring up this thing called Q code, like you may have heard the term QRP, which is low-powered radio. That's not a hidden coded meaning. Everybody knows Q codes. You can go on Wikipedia and look up the article. So we do have some abbreviations that people use, but it's a commonplace abbreviation that doesn't obscure the message. It just makes the message more brief, and brevity is the soul of wit in amateur radio. Question Delta 04, under what conditions is an amateur station authorized to transmit music using phone emission? So voice, right? This is A, when incidental to an authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communications. So what'll sometimes happen is the ISS will have some kind of video that they send out, and we retransmit that, and it may be amateur radio related or whatnot. And that's okay in that specific use case because they may have background music or something like that. Now, this is one of those, like, just to answer this question A, but I'm going to get a little bit more context. So let's say you're a part of a RACES team, or ARES, which is the Amateur Radio Emergency Service that is run by the ARRL, and you are at a parade and you are running support for emergency information or just general, whatever communication. And there's a band playing in the background and they're playing, I don't know, Cardi B or something like that. You're technically retransmitting that noise that's happening in the background, but it's not part of your transmission. It's not your goal to retransmit that music. It's more or less just happening in the background. So it was never your intent, you're not doing it on purpose, and it's more or less just because it's getting picked up as ambient noise. That's not really a problem either. It's not really preferred. If you can avoid it, try and avoid it. But at the same time, if you're rendering aid or trying to help people, or it's just something that accidentally happens, the FCC is not going to come kick down your door or anything like that. So there you go. Delta 05, when may amateur radio operators use their stations to notify other amateurs of the availability of equipment for sale or trade? Ooh, dipping into doing business. D, when selling amateur radio equipment and not on a regular basis. So you can't really have like, this is Joe's amateur radio retail hour where I tell you what I'm selling right now and then you come on down to my place and blah, blah, blah. This is like, hey, I'm talking to a guy on the air and he said, hey, I'm looking for an amplifier. And you go, hey, I have an amplifier. I'm selling this amplifier. And he goes, oh, hey, great, I'll take it. I'll see you, Tuesday. That's the idea with that. Delta 06, what, if any, are the restrictions concerning transmission of language that may be considered indecent or obscene? So like the FCC, words, Carlin or whatnot. So like George Carlin, Stand Up Act, that whole thing. And the answer is B, any such language is prohibited. So any of those words that the FCC objects to, you can't transmit over the air. Just keep that in mind. Delta 07, what types of amateur stations can automatically retransmit the signals of other amateur radio stations? There are 3, and the answer is D, repeater, auxiliary, or space station. For obvious reasons, the space station has a built-in crossband repeater. Repeaters, literally, that's their job. And auxiliary stations are, ones that you may be using to help you boost and retransmit your station, which is allowed. Delta 08, in which of the following circumstances may the control operator of an amateur station receive compensation for operating that station? B, when the communication is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution. So specifically when someone's getting paid to be a teacher. That's how that works. Delta 09, when may amateur stations transmit information in support of broadcasting, program production, or news gathering, assuming no other means is available? And that is A, when such communications are directly related to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. We will see something like this in the future, but amateur radio is one of those great emergency communication tools when there is like a degradation in our standard communication lines, like cell phones, or maybe the grid's down, and so a lot of telephone systems won't work, etc., etc. Amateur radio, you guys, we can step right in and say like, hey, we're just going to go over the air. That's fine. And if then a broadcasting station uses your information or you're reporting directly to them to get out information to save lives, like, hey, there's a huge flood over here, don't go over there, then it's okay. Again, saving lives. Keep that in mind. Delta 10, how does the FCC define broadcasting for the amateur radio service? And that's D, transmissions intended for reception by the general public. Just remember it. Delta 11, when may an amateur station transmit without identifying on the air? D, when transmitting signals to control model craft. There are quite a few people who get their amateur radio license to use our frequencies, our frequency allocations, to control rotorcraft and fixed-wing remote control aircraft. That is acceptable because you are literally sending the control commands for that thing, and you don't want to have to like do your call sign every time you tell it to turn left, right? No, it doesn't make any sense. All right, Section Echo for control operator eligibility, designating privileges, duties, location, control points, all those words that we'll explain as we get going. Echo 01, when may an amateur station transmit without a control operator? And the answer is D, never. Just never. A lot of times when the questions like these kind of come up, it's not a trick, but the key thing to remember is that you are the licensee. Right, the radio's not licensed, you're licensed. So the radio is just a thing. Your radio cannot be you. You must transmit into your radio. Echo 02, who may be the control operator of a station communicating through an amateur satellite or space station? D, an amateur allowed to transmit on the satellite uplink frequency. Again, you who are licensed appropriately to operate on the amateur radio frequencies. Okay. Echo 03, who must designate the station control operator? And it is A, the station licensee. So you could, this will come up later too, but if I wanted someone to sit at my station behind me here and transmit, they can do that, but I have to be there and in close proximity because they're literally like using my license to be able to use my radio. I should turn my radio and computer on too. Echo 04, what determines the transmitting frequency privileges of an amateur station? And that is D, the class of the operator license held by the control operator, right? That is what dictates where you can transmit and what privileges you have. So technician, as we're talking about today. Echo 05, what is an amateur station's control point? And that's C, the location at which the control operator function is performed, meaning in front of my radio with this microphone, pushing the button down and talking, or I have an iPad that remotely connects to this radio and I can go in another room and use my mic on the iPad to control the radio. That's the control point of where I'm at controlling the radio physically. Echo 06, when, under normal circumstances, may a technician class licensee be the control operator of a station operating in an amateur extra class band segment? A, at no time. At no time can you do that. You can't go down and operate outside of your privileged space. So keep that in mind. Echo 07, when the control operator is not the station licensee, who is responsible for the proper operation of the station? D, the control operator and the station licensee. This is kind of a who's responsible if something goes bad type of question. So my buddy, another ham, could come over here and operate my station, but if they're using it to run afoul of FCC rules, I'm technically liable for allowing them to operate, and they're also liable for what they've done. And there's other examples, but that's just the one that comes to my head. Echo 08, which of the following is an example of automatic control? And that is repeater operation, meaning I'm transmitting, I'm sending a code that turns the repeater on, it's retransmitting my information. That is remote operation. Echo 09, which of the following are required for remote control operation? Hey, all of these choices are correct. D. So let's read them. A, the control operator must be at the control point. B, a control operator is required at all times. C, the control operator must indirectly manipulate the controls. And so all of these choices are correct. So you basically have to be present. Either you're remotely controlling it via something where you have direct control so you can terminate transmission, or you can't leave it running on its own and then go to the market kind of thing, right? That's not allowed. And mainly a lot of this has to do with not interfering with other people. Your radio can just you could set it up to transmit just erroneous stuff. You could play music, right? All that stuff is not allowed. You have to be there, which means you're being responsible, and you can't do that kind of stuff. So keep that in mind. Echo 10, which of the following is an example of remote control as defined in Part 97? B, operating the station over the internet. Great, you can do that. That's a thing. Yeah, I can take my laptop, go to a hotel, and I can still tunnel in and talk to this radio and operate it remotely. And that works great. It's a lot of fun because sometimes I don't want to carry a bunch of radios out with me and I just want to have my laptop, which I always do anyway. And you can do that with amateur radio. That's allowed. Echo 11, who does the FCC presume to be the control operator of an amateur station unless documentation to the contrary is in the station records? And that's D, the station licensee. All right. Last section of sub-element 1, station identification, repeaters, third-party communication, club stations, and FCC inspection. That's going to be a good one. So this is Foxtrot. So Foxtrot number 1, when must the station and its records be available for FCC inspection? B, at any time upon request by an FCC representative. I have made a much longer form video on this topic alone, talking about technicians, amateur radio operators giving up their Fourth Amendment rights. The reality of this is you can say no to an inspection of your site, your station, but be prepared to lose your privileges and your license within amateur radio. You are not forcibly required to give up your rights in being an amateur radio operator. Just assume that there will be repercussions if you tell them no. This is an outside point that I'm going to make that is not related to this whole discussion, but an FCC investigator, even if you are not amateur radio licensed, can still come to your home and ask to inspect specific things like your Wi-Fi router. They could have justifiable cause to believe that your malfunctioning router is causing interference to someone within some close proximity to your home, and they can ask to inspect it and only it. Meaning you take them to the device, they inspect it, and then they leave. Now, if in the process of walking from your door to that Wi-Fi router, they witness a number of crimes, then sure, there could be other issues that end up happening and other agencies getting involved with those crimes, and they kind of have a duty to report. But just remember that if they have a reason to come to your home for an investigation, it doesn't matter what radio service you're using, and you may not even be actively thinking that you are using an amateur radio service. If interference is being created, they will want to investigate it if people have complained. There's a friend of mine who, not a ham, not GMRS, not CB, nothing, got a knock on the door from the FCC. They wanted to inspect his cable TV box because they believed it was creating interference. And ultimately, it turned out to be a cable company issue, and the interfering device was a kind of a repeater box or an amplifier box that they were using on like a telephone pole or something just outside this person's home. They still asked to inspect it, and it has nothing to do with him being a ham or not. They're still going to ask if they think that there is something fishy afoot, or they just want to stop the interference because it's incidental to that homeowner, but causing someone else a problem. It does happen. All right. Foxtrot 02, how often must you identify with your FCC assigned call sign when using tactical call signs such as race headquarters? And the answer to this is C, at the end of each communication and every 10 minutes during a communication. This is the standard answer for when do I have to use my call sign. The answer to that is always when you finish a communication or within 10 minutes, whichever comes first. That's when you have to identify yourself. It doesn't matter if you've got a fancy title for whatever event you're at or whatever. Foxtrot 03, when are you required to transmit your assigned call sign? We're going to hit this dead horse a little bit. D, at least every 10 minutes during and at the end of a communication. And what they mean specifically is at the end, like when you're done having a contact with somebody, you go, okay, 73, Kilo India 6, November Alpha Zulu. And that's it. You're done. Like you closed up the contact. We're moving on. Foxtrot 04, what language may you use for identification when operating in a phone subband? The answer, C, English. That's it. Foxtrot 05, what method of call sign identification is required for a station transmitting phone signals? B, send the call sign using a CW, which is continuous wave, another way we say Morse code, or phone emission. So yeah, you could just have a little button that played your call sign when you're on the radio, which, this radio will do, some other radios will do it too. And that's it. You just use your Morse code as your call sign, and that works just fine. Foxtrot 06, which of the following self-assigned indicators are acceptable when using phone transmission? And the answer is D. All these choices are correct, and they are KL7CC stroke W3, KL7CC slant W3, and KL7CC slash W3. These are all just the same call sign with different words to represent a slash mark. That's all it's saying. Foxtrot 07, which of the following restrictions apply when a non-licensed person is allowed to speak to a foreign station using a station under the control of a licensed operator? B, the foreign station must be in a country with which the U.S. has a third-party agreement. That goes back to earlier in this video where we talk about the International Telecommunications Union and whether or not that country of origin has okayed communication via the amateur radio bands. The closest, most recent example that I have of something like this where we kind of made some news was when Ukraine terminated radio communications of the amateur variety for a limited time as the war continued. That means that if someone, a ham from Ukraine, was transmitting, trying to make contacts, it would not be okay for me to reply to them and make contacts with them. Foxtrot 8, what is the definition of third-party communications? Meaning I sit my wife or my kid in front of my radio and I have them operate. A message from a control operator to another amateur radio station control operator on behalf of another person. This can also be the opposite way where I am relaying that information to someone else. That is third-party communications. Foxtrot 09, what type of amateur radio station simultaneously retransmits the signal of another amateur station on a different channel or channels? We've talked about them a lot. C, repeater stations. Foxtrot 10, who is accountable if a repeater inadvertently retransmits communications that violate the FCC rules? And that is A, the control operator of the originating station, meaning if 50 hams all know the PL tone for a repeater and we use it in our local community and it's owned by a ham, and I transmit something that is in violation of the SCC guidelines, I'm the control operator of that repeater at the moment because I'm the one that's using my radio to activate the repeater. And if I do something that's a faux pas, it's on me that the issues arise. So there you go. That is sub-element 1. Appreciate you all watching. We're going to continue on down the sub-element train, going through all the sub-elements of the technician class. I would appreciate it if you subscribed to this channel for more videos like this and actually a bit more in the explaining how this works. We're taking a fairly fast and to the point deep dive here, but if you want to flesh out your knowledge, please go to my channel and click on one of the first playlists at the top that says, Are You New to Amateur Radio? Click here and just click on whatever you want to flesh out the details on. There's a number of videos in there that should help you out. I am Josh, KI6NAZ. There is a link to the playlist of all the sub-elements for this video series that you can find, and among the other learning and training materials that I recommend in the video description. Thanks for watching. 73.